Now remember, vegetation is an important component because it can tell us a whole lot of things. It gives us habitat of animals, but it also can tell us environmental information. So it's really nice and simple things to do. Now we could describe vegetation communities in any way we want. Some of them mightn't be very useful. You know, we could describe it in terms of color, doesn't help us much, but there's a number of major ways. And the first one I want to describe is how you could describe the vegetation in terms of all of the scientific names. So I could go out into a patch of vegetation and I could write a list of the species that I come across. Now, there's 1,300 species in the Sydney Basin. Royal National Park alone has more than 1,100 species. If I described vegetation, a vegetation community on the basis of the species that are in there, the floristics, I come up with something called a vegetation association. Another way to describe vegetation is on the basis of how it looks. And how it looks is referred to as physiognomy. And this is a big, nasty word, and you can tell I've practiced physiognomy, and all it refers to is how the vegetation looks. And it's like the science of morphology. You know, if I was describing a bird versus a lizard versus a whatever, I would be describing the physical shape. And the physiognomy of the vegetation is how it looks. And it's predominantly made up of the life forms of the species in it. Now, life forms is a word that you might not have come across, but you know, if I drew this, most of you would know that's a tree. And then if I drew something on the same scale and it looks something like this, that's a shrub, and I might have some grassy type things. You know, a tree versus a shrub versus a grassy type thing is a life form. Sometimes people use the word habit, and habit is, you know, you could have a tree that was multi-stemmed. We have some beautiful vegetation communities, or we did. In fact, a lot of them have been cut down, but we had these mallee eucalypt woodlands, particularly Western Victoria, multi-stem trees. And so that habit is a mallee form. So here's a tree, the same life form, but the tree has a different habit. Let's get back to physiognomy. And now if I describe the magic of technology, let's get rid of that for the moment. Now, if I describe a vegetation community on the basis of its physiognomy, then I am actually describing something that's not a vegetation association, but a vegetation formation. And remember, physiognomy is just how it looks. So some of the components that are important, not only life forms, but you know, how high are the trees? How much cover does the canopy make? So for example, I could draw a forest. Now we'll get back to this because it's a really important concept. I could draw a forest and it looks like this, and then I could draw a woodland and it's also got trees, but in this case the trees are more widely spaced. So here we've got the same life form. They could even be the same height. These trees could be both 20 meters high, for example, and they've got a different distance between them. And that means that if I was laying, oh, wouldn't that be nice? If I was laying here, if I was laying in that and I was looking up at the sky, I wouldn't see much sky. Whereas if I was laying over in this woodland, yeah, I'm laying in this woodland, I'm looking up at the sky and I would see more sky. And that's called cover. And I use the word projected foliage cover. And in fact, I use it wrong because it's actually foliage projected cover, but we'll call it projected foliage cover. And it's me laying in the vegetation community, looking up, imagining how much of the ground is covered. Now, so let's get back to physiognomy. So I just want to spend a little bit more time talking about physiognomy. It's really important. It's the crux of what we're going to be doing in the field. So it's worth spending a minute on it. Remember, physiognomy is how the vegetation looks. And that is, let's put that on, how it looks. And it's really about the life forms that make up the vegetation community and those life forms are all those common words, trees versus shrubs versus grasses. Now, when I get into a vegetation community, the first thing that I consider is how does it look? And the very first thing I do is I ask myself, what are the strata? Singular, stratum. You know, the vegetation often forms layers, and you've probably heard all symbol, you know, they're very common terms, things like canopy or subcanopy or a shrub layer or even a grass layer. These are all strata and very common strata. You know, if I was going to draw a simple vegetation community, let's think about a very important vegetation community originally in Sydney was the Cumberland Plain woodland. It's got these big tall trees. It's got these, and they're big eucalyptus trichocornis, beautiful big tree, lovely wood as well. And then it's got this occasional shrub there, which is Bersaria spinosa, a nasty, the words, whenever spinosa's in a name, you know it's got spines. And then it's got this grass everywhere. So it's a kind of a grassy, open woodland. And if I went to a completely different vegetation community in Sydney, another example, on shale. This is a shale community which is dry. If I went to a wet shale community, I could get blue gum high forest. High forest. Now, high forest has these big, tall trees, like the blue gum forest, if you've ever been up into the Blue Mountains. Amazing forest. Big, tall blue gums. It's got no shrubs, very rare little micro shrubs. It's got some grasses in there, and it's got ferns everywhere. You know, so these vegetation communities have completely different structures. One has a very continuous canopy. This one only has occasional trees. So the canopy cover is much lower. This idea of height and canopy cover are really fundamental ways of describing vegetation on the basis of its physiognomy. And when I'm describing vegetation on the basis of how it looks, its physiognomy, I'm actually describing vegetation formations. So, Cumberland Plain woodland is a vegetation formation. Blue gum high forest, a vegetation formation. Beautiful forest that happened in the original Sydney Basin, hardly around anymore, both critically endangered.